We're so excited to have MOJA come to our neighborhood. This neighborhood is rich with history. So welcome to this panel discussion.
My name is Michele Moore, and I'm the author of the Cigar Factory novel. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank the St. Julian Center for hosting this MOJA panel, as well as the Eastside Development Corporation. So thank you all very much. The Cigar Factory novel tells the story of two Catholic families in Charleston from 1917 to 1946, the white McGonigal family and the African-American family of Malia Amy Ravenel. Aunt Cassie and her niece Bridget work upstairs in the factory as cigar makers. Malia Amy works in the basement stemming and processing the tobacco. Language is central to the story that I wish to tell, and it's been my observation that in varying levels of intensity and consistency, aspects of the West African-based Gullah Geechee language and associated communication styles can be heard in the speech patterns of many older Charlestonians, regardless of race or class. Linguists acknowledge the significant influence of West African pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary on overall Charleston speech. However, linguists draw a distinction between Gullah Geechee Creole and Charleston English. On October 29th, 2015, Trident Technical College will host the premiere of a performance reading of excerpts from Part 1 of the 5-part novel. And this will be in conjunction with Spirit Week and the annual celebration of the Eastside community. So our panel today has gathered to share experiences and opinions about Gullah Geechee language and identity, the controversial and emotional territory of writing and dialect, and finally, the historical significance of the cigar factory and surrounding Eastside community.
Growing up in Charleston, we didn't really have a deep appreciation of the culture. At least I didn't in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It wasn't until I left Charleston that I understood that this was a unique culture tied with African cultures as a result of transatlantic slavery.
Our African ties, as I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, was a little bit more intimate. Our family has always been very close-knit, and when you talk about the Gullah Geechee dialect, the actual language itself, I call it my mother's tongue.
It was our language, so we understood it, although we studied and read and knew when we went to school. You know, our teachers, our preachers, our Sunday school teachers, they taught us the right way.
I have been interested in a man named Sam Dickerson, who in the 1880s was a lawyer, and they make just merciless fun of him in the newspaper. You know, he uses malapropisms, everything is rendered in this very thick, heavy dialect. They're using dialect as a weapon to make him appear less eloquent than he really is. So it's a really complicated problem, and I can understand why some people cringe when they see dialect on the page, they hear dialect used in some literary way. And yet, it is a very eloquent language, and there are ways to, I think, preserve the flavor and do what Julia Peterkin did, and use it as a very potent kind of literary form.
Gullah Geechee language, it is a legitimate language. And you have to understand the development of African mind when we were brought here. The African mind represents a very unique human experience because under complete physical, emotional, psychological trauma, something evolved out of the African spirit, which manifested itself in the art of improvisation. You see, Gullah Geechee is really the synthesis of everything that was going on to the African mind in a way that could be expressed verbally, in a way that they could understand among themselves. And the same thing was expressed in other areas of life. In the cooking, for instance, we took what we had to make what we need, you see. And in jazz, you see improvisation is an extremely important African-American contribution. And so when you mentioned the gentleman who was ridiculed because of his dialect, being able to, when the proper moment came, to be able to express himself with the kind of articulation that could be respected, that is what my grandparents were training us, you know. Make sure you're proud of how you talk when you're home, but make sure you're an expert. You have to go beyond what the dominant culture teaches their children, because you have to know yours and you have to master theirs, so that you can get to them and they can't get to you. There was a large percentage of our people who were ashamed of our Gullah Geechee heritage, because it was beat into them literally in some cases to be ashamed of it. You know, it was called broken English. Just the idea of something being called broken, it wasn't broken English, you know. And so I get a little passionate about that kind of stuff. But I'm just grateful that you brought these points out, both of you did, because it gives us gave me a chance to just vent a little bit.
Kids my age in Charleston, like, they really don't understand too much anything about our African culture here. I mean, I do, because I grew up downtown. I grew up right here. Basically, I grew up in this building as well, because I was one of the kids who used to run around here on the playground. I used to live right across the street, right here on Blake Street, or Drake Street. So, I mean, I have grandparents who worked their whole lives on the market. Their whole lives making spices, selling it to the tourists. I used to make roses, making my own money, because they told me, if you want to live in this household, you have to learn how to do something, make a trade. Your education is part of your growth, and if you don't have an education, you're not going to be anybody in this world. No matter if you're white or black, period. That's right. So they wanted everybody in my household to know something.
You know, when we left Ansonboro to go to school and college in Columbia, USC, and Allen, and then later on when you got a job, and you tell people you grew up in the borough, Ansonboro, they said, golly, you came from that poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
But we weren't poor. We weren't poor. We weren't poor at all. We had a church home at Emmanuel. We had loving and caring teachers at Buste. Same here at C.A. Brown. We had people in the community who, if you were doing something mischievous on the way home, they would say, your mama know you're doing that? And sometimes if you wanted to really get popped in the mouth, you'd answer back, if mama knew that, I wouldn't be doing it. You know, so, but you dare not say that. So,
no,
you know. But to pick it back on what you were saying about the improvisational nature of the African funeral song, the Mende funeral song, in the Mende language of Sierra Leone, it used to be part of an ancient burial ritual called the Tejami. When the Sierra Leonean men returned to Sierra Leone after World War I, after fighting for the British in Europe, they came back to Sierra Leone and they said, we have to give up this Tejami, which was sort of kind of a pagan kind of religion. So they adopted Christianity or Islam. So the funeral song was put on the shelf, became a very archaic part of their culture. But it was not forgotten. It was picked up by, and it was continued to be used by the family, because the funeral song is part of a family. A family has ownership in the song. And in this particular family, the Jabatee family, Bendu Jabatee, as she became more of a leader of the singer of the song in the community, she kept the core of the song, Awaka Mamona, which means y'all come. The grave is not yet finished. She kept the core of the song, but then she added other elements, improvised in the song. And the song, she sang the song on the radio, and she would travel the communities singing the song with these other elements of the song to reflect the culture at that time. Her keeping the core of the song was one of the key parts of how the researchers, led by Joe Opala, Cynthia Smith was a linguist, and Tazif Karoma, a Mende linguist, was able to determine that that song was indeed the same song that the family in Georgia possessed. The family in Georgia didn't know the history, didn't know the language of the song. So they passed that song from Amelia Dawley to Miriam Moran, and it stayed in that one particular family. And it was because of the isolation of color culture in Harris Neck, Georgia, that that song and their language and their culture and their traditional way of life carried forward for 3 generations post-emancipation.
Fascinating.
So Michele, you should talk about how you came to write the novel and the play, your take on dialect.
Oh my gosh, I didn't prepare for my own answer. I suppose one story that my family also lived on the east side, and as you know, housing in Charleston was never segregated by law. So as people will often say, well, the east side was a very integrated neighborhood back in the day. And I have a picture of my grandmother on a front porch on Drake Street, and I think the house has probably been torn down. And other relatives lived here, and my father was raised by his great aunt who worked at the cigar factory. He worked briefly at the cigar factory and had other cousins that worked there. And I lived here after college for a few years and worked at the medical hospital. And some reason I thought, at some point in time, wow, that big building, that's so uncharacteristic, this Victorian industrial age thing here in Charleston in the agrarian South, and then I thought, and I have this, this relative who was a cigar maker. How come I've not really thought about that? And so then that started me on the path of the cigar factory and exploring the history there. And every step of the way, the history was just incredible, and I felt just fortunate that I would be the one reading this history. It was just amazing. And then when I started interviewing my relatives to help me with the setting in the 20s, and I'd ask them, well, what did you eat, and what'd you do for fun, and then as I would listen to their tapes, I also started realizing that because I grew up in Atlanta, the sound, their accents, their voices were so important. And so I listened to the tapes, and I have a relative that I interviewed, and she was out on Sullivan's Island in the summer, and I was asking her, she said they ate a pot of civvy beans. And so I said, well, what is a civvy bean? Is it like a green bean or a kidney bean? And she can't come up with the word, and she keeps struggling. What's a civvy bean? It's a civvy bean. That was the only word she knew. But then finally she was able to get out, it's a lima bean. And so when I went home and I asked my father, do you know what a civvy bean is? Oh yeah, civvy bean. Haven't heard that term in a long time. It's a lima bean. Well, as you would say, fast forward, and after I had written probably the first draft of the novel, and I knew that writing it, there was just the way people spoke was part of the story. And I think I definitely tried to resist it because of the problems of dialect and writing in dialect. But it was my own family speaking that way as well, and I wanted to record that as well. So then I just kind of committed to, okay, I'm in my private space, so I will write this how I hear it. And then I went back to Lorenzo Dal Turner's book after a lot of other research, and finally after listening to all those tapes for so long, I was actually able to make sense a little bit of his book. It's such a linguistic, scholarly book that it really hadn't made any sense to me when I tried to read it. But then after listening to all those tapes of my relatives, then reading Turner's book, suddenly some of the things he was saying, it clicked in a major way that these, what the linguists call associated communication styles, not just the language, but was how my family spoke as well. And then when I came upon that civvy is a Wolof word for lima bean, it was the missing link. And I thought, okay, so if I have this elderly white relative who the only word she can come up with for a lima bean is an African word.
Like we say tote.
Yeah, exactly.
We say tote, and we say bubba.
Yeah.
You know?
And I'm sure there were more words, so I thought, because that was 2009. So then I kind of knew, and one, it's fiction, so I certainly take a lot of license, it's fiction, and I use language as an artifact, you know, in the way I would see that maybe in a painting, a painter might have an artifact from another time in history, say on a contemporary modern street, and I thought, well, I'm going to take words from another time, maybe even further back. As you know, when people are in the reading practice, in the rehearsal, some of the words Ndanu and some of those African words, so they're in the script, and maybe they were used in Charleston, maybe they weren't, but in that sort of artistic way, I wanted them in the script as an artifact of the African language. If you're going to depict how people sound, then depict how people sound in all your characters. So whether it sinks or swims, we don't know yet, but the book will come out in January. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
This world is one great battlefield with forces all arrayed. But in my heart I do not yield, will overcome some.